Okay, so welcome everybody to our Fantastic Language Angels webinar this evening. It's the 12th of October 2020, and we're going to hear from Paolo and Francesca all about the Language Angels resources, and in particular working on progression in primary foreign languages. This is a Jodel webinar, completely free for you to attend, and we will be recording the session as we are right now, and it'll be going on my YouTube channel, which is available at Jodel 100. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Paolo and Francesca to the webinar, and over to you guys. Looking forward to your session.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thanks for inviting us along, and thanks for letting us take part. And hello to everybody that's joining us live this evening, and for anybody that's watching afterwards, hello to you too. But before we start, I've just noticed we changed camera, and this camera is HD. And we had quite a large square when we were talking with Joe just now, and I apologise for the bags, okay? It's just life, it's the way it is. It's been a tiring week. For those of you that know us, I'm Paolo from Language Angels, this is Francesca. Hi. We always like to make it very clear from the start, we are married. So I think everyone knows that now. As well as working together, we live together normally until Francesca chucks me out in the garden. But so we're here, it's a team, and there are other people, and I'll mention that as we go through. We're doing the session together. Obviously, we're working from home at the moment, so if it's a little bit DIY in terms of handovers, I apologise in advance, but we'll try and make it as smooth as we can. I'm going to be starting the session off. I'll do a bit of an intro. Francesca's going to take the lion's share of the presentation, going through how we approach progression at Language Angels, how we build it into our resources, and then how we help our schools develop it and demonstrate it with all of the stuff that they do throughout all of their teaching in primary phase. I'll then come back on at the end and I'll tidy a few things up. I'll also do a very, very brief demo of how we at Language Angels help some of our users actually demonstrate progression that's taking place in their teaching using our resources. But that will be very, very brief at the end. As Joe said, please feel free to fire questions in as we go. I'm sure he'll jump in as and when the questions arise, and we'll do our very best to answer them as we go through that session. So for those of you who don't know who we are, I can see I saw some of the names and some are familiar. So those of you that are Language Angels users, hi, and thanks for joining us this evening. Those of you who don't know who we are a small team, but it is a growing team. It's a team of teachers and linguists, and we are very passionate about language learning because we've been very fortunate in as much as that we've grown up as linguists, almost by accident, an accident of birth, being born into families that speak other languages, and therefore growing up learning languages almost by default, and understanding how much of an advantage that is. And wanting to try and give as much of that advantage back to our young learners today. We work with over 1,250 schools at the moment, and that number also, like our team, is growing. Predominantly we're based in the UK, but we are adding schools from further afield, whether it's, we've got schools in Africa, schools in Australia, schools in the UAE. So our reach is expanding, but the vast majority of our schools still are based in the UK. And because we work with so many schools, what we do get is an awful lot of interaction with all of the teachers in those schools on a very regular basis. And what that does enable us to do is to get lots of real classroom feedback on a very regular and timely basis. And what we always try and do at Language Angels is feed as much of that feedback and information from the classroom back into our resources to try and make sure that our resources are as representative and fresh, if for want of a better word, as possible, so that they're always providing the most up-to-date and supportive set of resources that we can possibly put together for the teachers that we work with. Who's going to benefit from this session? Well, this session really is for you if you are keen to embed languages in your curriculum in a sustainable way, primary foreign languages. It's for you if you want to be able to demonstrate to the pupils in your classes and your school as a whole is meeting whichever attainment targets you've been set. Now, we're based in the UK, so our resources are developed and designed around meeting the attainment targets as stipulated in the programme of study from the Department for Education for Languages at Key Stage 2. But everything that Francesca and I are going to go through in this session is applicable to whichever attainment targets you have set personally for your foreign language teaching in your school, or you have had set for you, whether that's by your school or by the state or the country in which you work and live. So whilst we're referring very specifically in this session to the UK attainment targets, please remember that whatever we're saying is applicable to any attainment target. And that's because what Francesca is going to show and demonstrate throughout her session, her part of the session, is how we take attainment targets and link them back to those key language learning skills. And it's those things that are uniform and constant through any language learning, whichever country you're coming from, or whichever language you're learning. So we're going to demonstrate how we build our resources and how that works by ensuring progression happens throughout everything that we do. Okay, so as well as the attainment targets, it's also for you, if you are keen to be able to demonstrate the progression is happening in your teaching, and it's for you if you want to achieve all of these things in a way that's effective and enjoyable, but also very importantly, as stress-free as possible for teachers, obviously, because we've got enough stress as it is, and also for pupils. So in what are very difficult and strange times, trying to make that delivery of fantastic language learning lessons as enjoyable and stress-free as possible is what we're all about here at Language Angels. What are we going to cover? Or Francesca will cover most of it for you. Is we're going to look at how we've built all of our resources and structured everything we do in terms of resources at Language Angels around progression, around ensuring progression happens, around ensuring that as well as the progression happening, it is demonstrable for you as teachers and for pupils so that they can see what they're learning, feel that they're learning, and you're able to back that up and demonstrate it to them also. The way we're going to do that is Francesca's going to go through her session looking in detail at two of our units. One from the very beginning of the language learning journey. That's what we call one of our early language learning units, so at the start of foreign language learning in primary. And then we're going to compare and contrast that with one of our sort of progressive units, which happens towards the end of the language learning journey. And you'll be able to see how the units themselves have progressed in terms of the quantity of language, the complexity of language that we're teaching in our classes, but also you're going to see how within those units there is progression built in to the individual lessons that take place in take part in what has become part of our units as we go. As I said earlier, whilst our resources are developed around the English Key Stage 2 programme of study from the DFE, because we're linking it to skills, whatever we're talking about here in terms of pedagogy, methodology, is applicable to whatever language you're teaching, in whichever country you're teaching it. So please keep that in mind as we go through. And I need to point out here, Francesca will be demonstrating and looking at resources in French today. But again, like I said, whichever language you teach, what we talk about today will apply. So it's probably easiest if we start, just before I hand over to Francesca, with summarising what we're seeing in the schools from the teachers that we work with in those many schools around the country. We have very regular daily contact with teachers, and what we've noticed over probably the last 6-7 months,
lockdown,
since lockdown started, a lot more interaction with teachers, perhaps because there was a bit more time available, but then also because they wanted to make sure that what was being taught and what they were prepping for school and for class was exactly what they needed it to be. And there was a big focus on progression. And I suppose those 3 bullet points at the bottom of the screen cover the main areas that teachers were raising when we were talking about progression. It's, do I use attainment targets solely? Do I try and focus my demonstration of progression around skills? And then do I use assessment to demonstrate that progression is actually taking place in the lessons that I've taught. So I'm going to hand over to Francesca now. She's going to go through in detail all of the questions that we've highlighted here, and I'll be back on at the end to just tie a few things up and then hand back over to Jeff. So I'll hand over to Francesca.
You have to shift over the...
Sorry, my chair got stuck at this table later. I apologise. I told you it was going to be DIY.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to see so many of you. I know things in school are really, really hectic and really busy and really difficult. As Paolo's been saying, we've had loads and loads of contact, and the contact seems to be changing. So obviously during lockdown, it was all about progression in terms of planning and schemes of work and what to teach when. And now the progression discussion has changed slightly with the recovery curriculum and with bubbles, you know, having to work from home, teachers sometimes at home with the bubbles. So let's see what we can get through today and see if we can help you. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk obviously about how we've organised things at Language Angels. So we're going to share with you all our methodology, all our way that we see our pedagogy. We're going to look at some units in detail. And for those of you that are looking at what you're teaching and your materials, I'm hoping it will be really helpful for you in terms of organisation. So as Paolo said, with all of this contact, lots of teachers have been asking us questions. And the question that I get asked really often is, what does progression look like? And my answer is always, well, it's going to be different for every school, because rather than thinking always in terms of progression, I like to think in very simple terminology, because I'm not somebody that uses long fancy words as you're going to be able to see today. I want to know what the kids can actually do. What language can the children reproduce? And we want to find a way of measuring that to demonstrate the progression. So if we look up progression in a dictionary, what we get is developing or moving gradually towards a more advanced state. And when I prepared the webinar with Paolo a while ago, and I looked at that, I thought that is actually exactly what we do at Language Angels. We take something and we break it down into the tiniest little building block. And with those little building blocks, sometimes Paolo refers to it as language Lego. Yep. We like to put things together and gradually create this progression that hopefully today I can show you, you can do in a lesson, in a unit, in a teaching type, and across a key stage. And then you will see how the children progress, but also be able to measure what they can actually do. So what we want to know is, what exactly are you going to teach? When are you going to teach it? And how are you going to teach it? And Paolo's already talked about skills. So we're going to look at skills in a lot of detail today. Now, we are going to look at our programme of study attainment targets. I say our programme because we're working in the UK, but that's just what we have here. And as Paolo explained, that's a tool that we use, but because we're talking about skills and units and topics and themes, that's applicable to whatever you're using. So take your scheme of work, your program of study, what you've been given and your materials, and apply what we've been saying, what we're going to tell you today, and see if you can break it down and then create these tiny little building blocks that are going to be able to help you measure progression, but importantly, be really crystal clear to the children that you're teaching what's happening. And I think sometimes we're so engrossed in preparing and planning and mapping out that we forget what that's going to look like for the children. So never forgetting that the children are going to need to see this progression too, so that they can feel that they have a success and we can measure what's happening in the classroom. Now, in terms of our programme of study attainment targets that we have in the UK, there are 12 of them, and they are very, very, well, brief. I think is the way to.
I think there are statements that could be read by some people and maybe feel that they're a bit vague.
Vague.
But actually, if you read them and dig into them, yes, there's quite a lot of guidance and detail in there.
Now, I'm going to show you the 12, even if they're not applicable to what you're actually doing, because I think it's relevant to what we're going to discuss afterwards, to show you that we've been handed something that we've used and built a programme of study, our own curriculum around. I really like these 12 program of study attainment targets because they are so vague. And as resource writers and linguists, like Paolo said, we've been able to read into them, unpick them and create something. But we completely understand that if you are a language lead, for example, today, listening, and you're feeling a little overwhelmed, it can be very difficult to know exactly what to do when with these 12 attainment targets. So if I just show you, for example, the first page, numbers 1 to 6, and 6 to 12 is on the other page, you can have a read through as I'm talking to you. I think that it's very difficult when you look at these to go back to my definition of progression, of developing or moving gradually towards a more advanced state, to understand how these can show progression, because as you read from 1 to 6, you immediately realize that 1 is not easier than number 6. And we turn to the next page, you'll see that they aren't building, they are just statements. And if we look at number 1, for example, listen attentively to spoken language and show understanding by joining in and responding. What does that actually mean? So if I take that and I apply it to what I'm doing in class, we're all competent teachers watching today. Does it mean I learned something from off by heart in responding? Are there fixed questions? Is this for any topic or is it for a specific topic? Because often what we get asked is, what should I teach? You know, what's the vocabulary? What's the language? And the problem we have with our 12 attainment targets is that there is no list of vocabulary, there is no list of topics. And if I now change slide and show you the next 6, 12 is my favorite because I like grammar. And those of you that have heard me say this before are probably thinking, we know, but I really like grammar and I love grammar at Key Stage 2. And Key Stage 2, for those of you that aren't familiar, is, I always get this wrong, age 7 to 12.
7 to 11.
7 to 11, 12 is when they go to secondary. And in fact, in our new Key Stage 1 program, we've started introducing grammar in the lessons as well. And I think it's very important that we don't forget grammar. It's how you do it and how you build those skills in grammar. So going back to number 12, it's the longest and it's obviously talking about grammar. Does number 12 mean that we leave that till last and we only do it at the end? So do I work first with number 1, number 2, number 3, and then gradually, by the time I get to the end of our primary phase, which is year 6 and students are aged 11, do I finally spend time introducing number 12? Well, obviously that isn't the case. And all of these program of study attainment targets, I believe, should be used all of the time and met at various levels of challenge. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's about unpicking and to show the progression, or to build a program of study, a scheme of work, a set of resources that facilitate progression. Because remember, that's actually what we want to happen. We want the children to spend 4, 5, 6 years having really good language learning, teaching and learning. And by the time they leave primary phase, have a selection, a bag of knowledge, of things they can actually do, of transferable skills, because we strongly believe that skills are transferable. So if they don't study the same language at secondary, it is a shame and it's not ideal. But actually, the skills that they've learned in one language can be transferred if they've been taught in the right way, and progression then can take a different road, but it can still happen. So we really want the children to build on their skills. If we're going to dedicate at least 4 years worth of curriculum time to something, there has to be progression. It can't just be singing and reading a story. That all has its place. We want it to be fun, but it has to be, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, something extremely structured, well thought out and prepared, so that we all understand where the beginning of the journey is and where the end is, even before the children start. That has to all be mapped out, and then they can follow this journey, follow the program, study the lessons, and by the time they reach the end, the progression will be abundantly clear. But there will be benchmarks, there will be certain points throughout that journey where you will be able to measure the progression should you wish to, but definitely see it. And the children will be able to see it themselves, because they will see what they can do by using this particular way of organizing a set of resources. So we briefly looked at the 12 program of study attainment targets. Those of you that are working in the UK will know what they are. If you don't, you should know. In England, I'm going to get told off the whole time. These days, I know.
We have different rules to everyone else.
I know, in England, so I've got to be careful what I say. But actually, they're not the most important thing. They have, we know that we need to use them, and we are using them, but we've used them in conjunction with other things, because on their own, I don't believe that they can show progression. Just because you can tick something off, and you can very easily, as you saw, apply those program of study attainment targets to something that you're doing in class, in a lesson, as I will show you, or a unit, that doesn't mean the children can actually do anything. And if let's say a year 3 child has ticked off program of study attainment target 1, that doesn't mean that you're never going to tackle that listening skill again, and that they've done it and they don't have to do it again. So how can you show progression if they've met something once and you parked it and you moved on? Progression is ongoing, and it has to be a mix of things together. If you think about what you actually want the children to do in languages, we want them to be confident linguists and to be able to say, write, read, speak, understand the language that they're learning. Maybe not all from memory, but have a set of skills that they can call on. So we have our 12 main teaching requirement types identified that I talked to you about today. These are outlined for us in England for the end of Key Stage 2. So that would be when they leave secondary. So there's been a lot of confusion with the attainment targets to try and understand how to use them best. So just to make it clear, you're not to use numbers 1 to 3, for example, in year 3, and then 4, 5, 6 in year 4. I think that they need to be met multiple times and weaved in to all of the other amazing things that you're doing with your teaching. Now, the issue that we have, we didn't say something. No. The issue that we,
thank you.
I will do that at various points. So if you feel that you need to say something, you will have an opportunity.
You're trying to make sure I'm paying attention.
Yes.
Okay.
So the problem is that with these 12 program of study attainment targets, as I've already said, there is no list of grammar, and there is no list of topics, and there is no list of vocabulary, and there are no milestones or marker points provided for schools to be able to pause, to reflect, to measure. So resource writers like Language Angels have come up with their own ideas.
Thank you. Just going back to talking about sort of learning and progression, I like to think of learning in regard to the sort of program of study attainment targets we're mentioning here. Meeting them once in a lesson is proof of learning.
It's quite easy to meet them as well.
Because we are doing something which children are then able to say that I've learned that. But progression is quite different. Progression is doing that repeatedly at different levels of challenge throughout and over a period of time, throughout my period of learning in your school, so that the progression happens as my learning of the same point is developed over time. Sorry, that's me done.
Now, obviously, these attainment targets that I'm talking about will be different depending on where you're teaching and what you're teaching. But whatever those targets are that have been stipulated, organised, written for you, they need to be matched and integrated into the scheme of work, the textbook, the resources that you're using. So let's talk a little bit about Language Angels. So Paolo's already briefly mentioned that we don't organise our resources by age. We organise our resources by something called teaching type, which is reflecting their ability, so where they are in their language learning journey. So for example, at the moment, we have 3 different teaching types. Now I say at the moment because we've just launched a Key Stage 1 program, so that would be for really, really young learners, and we've integrated it into our early learning teaching type. But we have had some discussions whether we need to maybe introduce a 4th teaching type, but we're sticking with 3 at the moment. So let me briefly explain that we have early learning, intermediate, and progressive. So early learning are your entry level units. So each teaching type will have units. Each teaching type has a different amount of units, just because of the way that we think works best for us. So for example, intermediate has the most units at the moment. Early learning is aimed at the beginning of a language journey. Intermediate in the middle, obviously, when they've had a year or so of language learning behind them, and we feel that they have the basic skills, they've started to work on their memory skills, they have some basic grammatical knowledge. Then we feel that they're ready to take the next step and they go to intermediate, and then finally progressive. Now, there's been lots of discussion about our teaching types and who are they aimed at. So for today, I've put year 3 and year 6. So the beginning of a language learning journey and the end of a language learning journey. But I need to make it clear that you can only do our progressive units if you have completed most of our early learning and intermediate. Our progressive units are quite challenging. We have some academy chains that are using progressive units in year 7. For example, they require a certain level of linguistic ability and knowledge. There is more grammar, there is more text. And as we go through the slides today, hopefully, as I show you some of the lessons, it will be clear how the teaching types work. So we don't like to allocate units to particular year groups. We feel it should be on the level of challenge and linguistic ability to be able to tackle that unit. And it seems to be working very well, and the schools seem to be happy. So for example, if a school is coming to us for the first time and they've had what we call sporadic or poor exposure to a foreign language, we do not recommend starting a year 6 class, so an age 11 pupil, on our progressive units until they've had some early learning and intermediate. So often when a school comes to us and says we've not had a stable program in place, what would you suggest? We do what we call an accelerated program, where years 3 and 4 are only taught early learning, 5 and 6 start with early learning, but then move to intermediate, possibly 1 progressive unit by the end of the year, to prepare them really well for secondary. So it wouldn't be our ideal program, but it can be done, and they work just a little bit faster. Now, as you can see underneath each unit, so for year 3, we've today decided to show you the fruit unit, which is one of our favorite units. Obviously, it's learning about fruits. And for our year 6, we're showing you Me in the World, which is our intercultural unit, which brings together everything that they've been learning over the 3-4 years. And it is linking in with other areas of the curriculum, but you'll see when you see the unit how much more challenging it is. But what we're trying to show you today is progression happens in a lesson, in a unit, across a teaching type. Now, we didn't have enough time today to show you what intermediate looked like, but we thought if we showed you the beginning and the end, it would be clear.
Sorry, in fact, it's quite a nice time that I've just seen come up on the chat. So the question has come up from Maria asking about working books, but how often do we do writing activities? And it goes to what you just said, actually. And thank you, Negin, for coming in with the answer. We try and Francesca will cover this in a bit more detail shortly, Maria, but we try and develop and progress each of the skills, so speaking, listening, reading, writing, and grammar, in all of our units, all of the time. So in terms of the direct answer to your question, writing will be covered in every unit, at whatever level of teaching type challenge that we're delivering. So we will always try and develop each of those skills. So writing, yes, we appreciate is probably the most challenging of the language learning skills for young learners, but it's a skill that we have to develop in terms of our foreign language learning. And so we don't shy away from it. At Language Angels, we build it in gradually and gently, but every unit will have some writing exercises in there. Sorry.
And we do a lot of retrieval, and it's quite reciprocal. We recycle a lot of the language that the children learn, because obviously, because we have this flexible approach in terms of teaching type and the units available for teachers to teach, they are able to meet the grammar in a different theme topic with different vocabulary multiple times. And what we want the children to be able to do is apply those skills in the different topics and build their confidence and knowledge of the language as a whole. It's not in fruits just learning 10 nouns and articles. It's much more than that, and we'll be able to explore that as we go through. So if we look underneath here, we've written the program of study attainment targets. The reason we put these in was to show you that most of our units will meet all of the program of study attainment targets, because just of the way that the nature that we create the resources and we build all of the time. So surely, if we're already meeting all of these attainment targets in year 3 in this unit, why would we need them to be met again in year 6? Well, I think I've already said this a couple of times today. It's because we believe that those attainment targets should be constantly met, and each time they're met with multiple levels of challenge. Now, ideally, in our resources, we would like each program of study attainment target to be met in early learning, in intermediate, and in the progressive. And the way that our assessment works and our tracker tool is that when that data, I think you're briefly going to look at that at the end, when it's plugged into the software, it will tell you where the gaps are. And you'll see that when we break down the attainment targets, we look at skills, it will be very clear what the class, the pupil, the year group, what skill is missing or where they're having less practice in by the way that the resources are written. So there will be a difference in meeting number 1, program of study attainment target 1, which we said was focusing on listening skills in our fruits unit, compared to how the pupils are going to meet it when they are working through Me in the World in the progressive unit. There is a huge difference, and you can see the progression. You can see how that listening skill, where it starts at entry level in a very easy or an easier unit. None of our work is really easy, but resources, by the time they go to progressive, the difference is very clear. So should anybody come in and speak to you and say, you know, how do you know your children are progressing? Can you show me what their work looks like? It will be different in each school. The progression will not look the same in one school as in another, but it'll be very easy for you to show it because of the way that the resources in our particular case are organized. So I think what we need to just repeat now is meeting, ticking off, teaching an attainment target, however you want to articulate it, is not enough. It will not show you anything. It's all about the resources and the activities, the challenges, the work being set, what's being taught to the class that is going to show you the progression. And we need to have a look at where this progression is happening. And the only way that we believe at Language Angels that you can do that is using those attainment targets, obviously, to build your scheme of work, but it's focusing on the skills that is the key thing. So when the new program of study attainment targets were introduced, obviously we were already in business. We weren't quite like we are now, but we were already helping schools. And I would say probably half the resources that you see in Language Angels now had been written, and we had to lay everything out and decide what would fit and what didn't fit. Everything fit the new program of attainment targets. We had to rejig a few things, and we had to introduce, I think we did some work on the grammar, didn't we? And just recently the phonics. But nearly everything we had written was applicable. Because if you're teaching languages, it doesn't matter which language you're teaching, the skills are always going to be there. You need to be able to read, write, listen, speak, and understand the grammar. So everything we do is around the skills. And when we looked closely at the program of study attainment targets, we realized actually that you could divide the program of study attainment targets by skill. So you can see here that we've color coded. And just recently, we've done some more work on this. And we've created what we called a program of study attainment tracker.
Unit mapper.
Unit mapper, there you go, look at that. And we've plotted all of our units, and we've actually labeled everything in terms of program of study attainment targets, so that our schools can see exactly where these attainment targets are integrated into the scheme and how they're met. So if you're, yes.
So I was just going to say, by linking the attainment targets, whichever attainment targets they may be for you in the country in which you're teaching, by linking them to these skills, the key language learning skills, which are consistent across every language, whichever language it may be, this is how you can demonstrate progression. Because a simple statement, listen attentively to spoken language and show understanding.
I could apply that to anything.
That's a statement. But what you've got to break it down to is, what skill does that relate to? So that's a listening skill. Fantastic. Skills are what we can develop, and development is progression. And that's where we're going.
Because what you've got to think of is, how does that look in your class?
Yeah.
And how will that look in a year 3, so a pupil of 6, 7 years old? But how will that look in reality for a pupil in a year 6 class? And then you can start to see and start to map out and think, okay, and then you will see where the progression is. But then obviously you need to go by unit, by term, by year, however you are dividing your resources. In our case, it's by unit and teaching type. But actually, it could work just as well if you were doing it by year, for example. I mean, we like what we've done, but it doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it, obviously. But once it's all mapped out like that, then you can really plot and measure. So what we're talking about today is how you organize a set of resources, how you show the progression, how you can see it, and then Paolo at the end will take it to the next level, how you measure it. Now, I would say probably 90% of the schools we work with need to measure it. I don't think there are many that aren't measuring progression. Would you say that's correct or not?
Yeah, I think it depends.
It depends on the school's
depends
policy.
on your interpretation of the word measure. I think every school and every pupil wants to know that they are progressing. It goes back to what Francesca said earlier on in her presentation. Children learn more and respond better when they feel they are making progress.
And they can see it themselves.
And they can see it, but it's nice to be able to demonstrate that in actual stuff that they've done. So I will make it very brief at the end, but we do it a particular way at Language Angels. We're not saying it's the only way or necessarily the best way.
It's the
best way that we can find that works with our resources. So again, base it on skills, base it on progress, because that's what children respond to.
So it's about taking the attainment targets, taking the units, breaking them down into the tiniest little steps you can find, using the best resources, and then we will create the best outcomes for the children. When everybody is really clear about where they're heading, what we're supposed to be learning in this lesson, what does that mean for the end of the unit, what can we do by the end of the unit, if we can do this by the end of this unit, then by the end of the following unit we can, and then the building blocks are crystal clear for the pupils, importantly, for the teachers, for senior leadership teams, stakeholders, anybody coming in from the outside. You're all speaking the same language because everybody knows what's happening at any given time. So if we just quickly look at this, this is our graphic that we use all the time. There isn't one webinar that we don't dig it out. So we believe grammar underpins everything that we do, even in our Key Stage 1 program, where there is hardly any writing at all on the screen. We have created some written worksheets for the tiny ones to be able to complete, very basic. There is still an element of grammar weaved into that lesson. And then we attempt to have an equal focus on speaking, listening, reading and writing at the right time, presented at the right moment, that work together to create progression. Because I don't believe just with speaking and listening, you can get progression in a language. I believe you have to have all skills. And as I said, at different times, at different stages in the language learning journey, but you do have to have all of those skills at some point in the language learning journey, I feel, to be able to progress. Right, so now let's have a long overview at what we do. So the plan here is to show you what speaking, listening, reading and writing would look like in the early learning, that unit on fruits that I talked about, to the progressive unit in Me in the World. And then I'm going to talk about 2 units in particular. So I want to show you what it's going to look like across a teaching type, but in this particular instance, across a key stage. So So key stages, key stage 2, looking at those 7-year-olds, possibly younger, because these units are aimed at very young learners, and then what it would look like at the end. So I'm looking at the individual skills. You don't want to say anything? I think you're going to say something there.
I can.
No.
So it's like beginning of the journey,
Yeah, and the
on
end.
the left, end of the journey on the right.
So let's look at skills first. So if I just briefly explain to you what the content is of the fruit unit and the me in the world unit, it will help you, I think, understand better what the worksheets look like. So there are 6 lessons in every unit. There are 6 interactive lessons with all 4 skills catered for mostly. And then we provide some desk-based activities at the end, should teachers wish to use them. In the fruit unit, the 6 lessons are 5 teaching lessons and 1 assessment lesson. That is how we work. It's quite formulaic, it's very organised, so the teachers know exactly what they're doing. We aim for 6 units a year. Paolo and I differ. I always say go for 6. The reality is teachers do more 4 or 5 a year, because what we say is do a unit properly, explore, make sure that it's done properly with the children. Really good teaching and learning.
Real life often interferes with the primary curriculum, and we've got to be honest. Language is one of the first subjects that tends to get elbowed out if there's a bit of tightness on time. So aim for 6. Be happy at 4.
You don't have to do the assessment week for each unit. We suggest trying to get 3 in a year, or maybe 2, an assessment point at the beginning of the year and an assessment point at the end. We provide assessment for reading, writing, speaking and listening at the end of each unit. Most schools do an assessment for 2 skills, so that by the end of the year, they have enough data to be able to do things with and show senior leadership's team, and be able to measure the progress, as Paolo will explain later. So in our fruits unit, it's not just about learning the 10 fruits. In our fruits unit, they are going to learn the nouns and the gender determiners for 10 fruits, but they're also going to learn how to give an opinion that they like and they don't like fruit. So you can see here, this is a slide taken towards the end of the unit. I can't remember if it's lessons 4 or 5. I've only taken 1 slide because I can't show you everything, but when we go to the unit, you'll be able to explore it a little bit better. And what we expect a child to be able to do, is what we talked about at the beginning, what can they actually do? We expect them to be able to say they don't like or they like a particular fruit by the end of the unit. And there is differentiation in that, because there are 10 fruits they can pick and recall and use, and there are 2 opinions. So there's plenty of language there for them to be able to play with, manipulate, remember and use. By the time they get to the progressive unit, remember they would have done a variety of early learning and then a variety of intermediate, and we finally get to progressive. Me in the World is one of our most challenging units. There's plenty of material. They're learning about some characters from different countries in the world, and there's I can't remember if it's 6 characters in particular that are coming together and discussing where they live, their faith, their religion, and it's all in the target language, obviously. So here is Sangeeta, and she's talking about where she lives and how old she is. So we are recycling, as I mentioned before, previously learnt language that continuously appears and is continuously used, and we're expecting by this stage that the children are able to do that. But she's also going to talk about her favourite feast day, and they have been taught the language, provided that with that language during the various lessons in that unit. Now you can see here that this is a role play activity, and what we're expecting the children to do is have a role play. Now this particular card is divided in half because questions can be quite difficult to remember. So if they feel that asking the question is quite difficult, they have a form of support, but that can be turned the other way, and it's a pair work activity, and there are a variety of these sheets. And what we're encouraging the children to do is not give their own details at this stage, that comes last, is to use the details they're provided with and what they've learned to be able to have a conversation based around their favourite celebration and what they do in the celebration. So there is a huge difference in what we're asking a year 3 to a year 6 child to be able to manage, to be able to produce, to be able to remember, in terms of the quantity and the complexity of language. So just with the 2 sheets in front of us, we can see the progress that is taking place. And if the stakeholder was to come externally and ask, it would be very easy to show what we're expecting the children to be able to do at these two different levels of their language learning journey in speaking. If we go to listening in fruits, again, they've learnt their fruits and their opinions, and there is a listening task where they are being asked to listen and simply say if they like or they don't like, and they can put a tick across, mini whiteboard, thumbs up, thumbs down, they can use a smiley faces. So they just need to listen out for those key words. When we get to the progressive, the listening task is much more complex. Most of our listening tasks are read at native speed. We feel that we want the children to have a real feel for the language. We know that they won't understand everything. That's part of the training, the process, the language learning experience. And the children, when they are used to being presented with these tasks, get quite excited at being able to decode, unpick, and really enjoy the challenge. And there would be various activities. Again, we've just taken a slide out of the lesson. It's not in context, but there would be various activities. And this particular lesson has, I think, 4 listenings of the same length, where they are gradually being asked to do different things in each listening task. Now, if, for example, the lesson was shorter and we didn't have our 45 minutes and we found that, a lot of time was spent on the first one, that's fine. We always provide more materials than you need. You could decide to do the second and the third listenings in another lesson, or you might then decide to move on to lesson 3. But there are lots and lots of things that you can do with our resources. We write it all out for you, and we plot it, for want of a better word, map it all out. But our teachers often find that once they've been through the programme after a year, that they have the confidence to pick and choose what they think will suit their children best. Moving on to reading, again, I think you're getting the picture. When they, during the fruit unit, for example, they have to just read and then match. We don't give the English. We like them to use the images to start to learn to associate physical objects, hooks, images to what they're learning. These are really important skills going forward. And we do always provide the audio. So though this is a listening, if there are children that are finding it difficult to read, then we will let them hear the audio with the listening as well. So they can use the listening to support their reading. When we get to our progressive unit, this is a gap fill reading. We do lots of comprehensions. We try and vary the activities so that the children are not always exposed to the same genre of task. Here it's Sangeeta again, and they have to fill in the words into the gaps. Quite challenging, but I can assure you that our year 6 pupils, after having followed Language Angels for 4 years, now remember, they wouldn't be doing this in their first year of language learning. And if they came to us in their first year, we would not recommend the progressive units for year 6. We would suggest some early learning and intermediate. By the time they finish, they are in a position to be able to manage a task like that. With our writing, obviously with the young ones, it's very difficult because they're just learning their written skills in English often, or in the language, their first language. So what we're trying to do is encourage them to write, but give them as much support as possible. So all of our written work and all of our activities come with 3 levels of challenge. So there is a version of this sheet that wouldn't have the words underneath for the children, where they won't be expected to write from memory, for example. So again, we're offering this flexibility with the level of difficulty and challenge. Now, our final task here for our Me in the World unit is a translation task. So we have some email exchanges, we've got a lot of texting, we've created some blank sheets for children to use with lots of scaffolds, but there are activities where we're encouraging the children to match the language and this element of translation, because what we're trying to do is think about what their experience is going to be like in secondary. And in year 6, what I'm trying to do is give them as much exposure and practice and a feel for activities that they're going to do when they go to secondary. But again, they really enjoy this and it's supported. This version, I think, is the standard challenge. There is an easier version with less language to translate, but there's also a harder version as well, where they're not provided with the words at all, which I think would be nearly impossible, but it's in the resources.
I thought that was just a nice way. If I just go back, actually, I was going to see it's a very visual representation of progression, because each skill, you can see, effectively, what you're seeing on the screen will probably meet the same attainment target that has been set in the program of study, but you can see the different levels of complexity and challenge you can build in to meeting the same attainment target. And that's really the best way we can represent what progression looks like. Attainment targets are statements. Converting those to skills is then how you get to this progression. And you can't do it unless you focus it around the skills that you're developing.
And that's exactly what we're going to say on this slide, that progress of skills in skills is key. You need to decide what you think that looks like. So I always say, what do you want the children to be able to do by the time they leave? So I always start at the end, and then I like to work back. So what would I like the children to be able to do by the time they leave primary? So I would write a list, for example, of the structures, the language, the non-negotiables that I think that they should be able to do, and then create a program around that and take it all the way back to the beginning and start to build it. So there are these language learning blocks with this recycling all of the time, so that they will know language off by heart. They will have a list of vocabulary, and they will understand certain aspects of grammar and have basic skills that they can take to secondary and build on. So any good scheme of work should already be doing that for you in a different way, in a different shape, in a different form. You can't just tick things off, because actually you don't actually know if the children can do that. So that's happened to me lots of time. I taught really what I think is a great lesson. And then when it comes to get the children to try and show me, it hasn't been as great as I actually thought, because the children can't reproduce anything on their own. So there's a lot of energy going into planning and a lot of time spent. So what we're trying to say today is make sure that it's spent wisely, and that we're not overworking and trying to create schemes of work that actually won't mean very much, because the children can't do anything by the time they leave primary. So I always say, imagine if I was to come into your class and say, into your school, what can your children do? And you would give me this wonderful list of all of the great activities and fantastically creative units that you've taught. And then if I went into the class, what could the children actually show me? If I was to ask them something in the foreign language, ask them to write something, just from the top of their heads, would they be able to do that? And I think that would really be the sign if there's really good learning and progress happening. And obviously, if I went into a year 3 class, so a younger learner, and asked them to do something, and then I went to the end of the corridor, I went into an older pupil, into a year 6, for example, and asked the same questions, I should really, if there is an established program with teaching happening every week, be able to see a difference in what those pupils can produce, even at primary. There is no point of spending 30 minutes, 45, an hour a week with a class trying to teach them language if they can't do anything. So if you feel that that's not happening, then something's not working and it needs to be revisited. So you need to understand what you want them to be able to do by the end of a lesson, by the end of a unit, by the end of a year, or in our case, a teaching type, and then by the end of a key stage, so by the end of primary phase. So what do we want these children to be able to do by the time they go? And we need to have these measuring points, these points in their learning where we can pause and have a look and decide if it is actually happening, if the children can do this. So you can't just assess against an attainment target. It's very hard to demonstrate progression, as we've shown. Remember on the slide where I showed you early learning, and I wrote underneath all of the amazing, ticky off attainment targets that kids could do. And then I said to you, actually, I'm going to do that again with this unit. So that doesn't mean I don't teach the first unit. Of course, I teach the first unit, but those attainment targets can be met multiple times. It's how they're met, in what context, with which language, with which vocabulary. So we believe it's easier then to measure it if you use the language learning skills and then you tie that in to the attainment targets, and then you get progression, and that will be progression the children can see. You'll be able to measure things very easily. As I've mentioned, we offer assessment points at the end of each unit. I don't think it's necessary to assess at the end of each unit. You could use the worksheets I just showed you, the desk-based activities, the listening activities. You don't have to necessarily assess formally at the end of the unit. You would be able to know if the children know their opinions and fruits by that listening exercise, for example. You would be able to see what they can do in listening. The question would be, would they be able to write anything, speak, and read with that content as well? So, would you like to talk about the progression map, or do you want me to do it?
Before we do that, guys, is that okay if I've been asked a question sort of privately? So obviously I don't need to mention the person that's asked the question, but basically the question is, are the differentiated resources adaptable or editable for subscribers so they can be tailored for their own pupils? My understanding is they can't be. Is that right?
No, but
PowerPoints can't be.
Right.
Worksheets are provided in PDF, but they can be provided in editable format. However, the reason why we've tried to discourage editing the resources is because we tie them into our progression by tracking and progression tool, and by tying them into that, we kind of give a semi-guarantee that you're meeting particular attainment targets at a particular level of challenge. If you edit the materials, we lose the ability to give that guarantee. Nothing's stopping you doing it, but then we can't say for sure, because we don't know what you're changing it to. We can't say for sure that you are delivering a particular attainment target or a particular skill at a particular point. But the worksheets can be provided in editable format if they're required.
I was going to say, I mean, we respond to our schools. So if somebody requires something, then we create it. We don't get a lot of requests for worksheets to be adapted, but if somebody felt that something, I mean, it's quite easy for us to change things, and then we upload almost immediately. But on the site, they're all in, as Paolo said, in non-editable form. The progression map is a range of from a range of documents that we provide to our users, because obviously we have an overview of the whole program. People come in and out of Language Angels as they move schools or move year groups. So we try and provide as much support as possible. So for example, you may be a teacher in the final year of primary phase who has inherited a class, who has been through maybe 3 years of the Language Angels program, but hasn't actually taught it. And this is a very common problem that we have, where teachers come in and everybody's really used to the program and understands, but actually they're new to it. So what we have is we have an area on the site called the curriculum guidance page, which is there to show teachers in those positions, head teachers that might not necessarily be very, have a lot of knowledge of Language Angels, school governors, anybody, any stakeholders, external visitors, where there is documentation that plots everything and shows you exactly where things are. So this progression map is how many pages?
10, 12.
12, and it has all of our units on there, and it shows you how our early learning progresses within a teaching time. So as you move through the units in early learning, there are different things happening and there are different levels of challenge. So you progress as you work through early learning. You then move across into intermediate, and again, you build again in intermediate. Different units are covering different aspects of language learning. And again, many things are repeated, always in a different topic or theme. We don't recommend topics to be repeated or units. And then at the right moment, you move across again and you go to progressive teaching type and you do the final rungs of the ladder effectively before you leave to secondary. Now, you don't have to do all of the units. We offer a lot of flexibility, and some units are similar in terms of challenge, but within a teaching type, there is challenge. So somebody contacted us yesterday and said they were following our unit planner from the site and noticed that in 2 year groups, we were recommending intermediate units. As I said before, that we have the most number of units in intermediate. And the very intelligent, relevant question was, how will I be able to show, if anybody asks, the children are progressing if all they're doing is intermediate units for 2 years? Well, the answer to that is that intermediate within itself builds. So we suggest intermediate because the children are doing a particular range of grammatical concepts, for example, and they are repeating what they did in early learning. They're consolidating. A few new things are integrated, but we really start to build a bank of vocabulary, and we work on sentence structure and gradually building up to small text level. But we don't feel that they can do progressive unless they've really spent some time on intermediate. So that would be what we would suggest in terms of explaining the way that progression works within our resources. So what we're going to look at now is 2 units in particular. So I am going to look at fruits in a little bit more detail and show you how that progression will happen in a lesson across 6 lessons. So from a lesson across a unit, and then I'm going to jump, I'm going to miss out poor old intermediate again, and we're going to go straight to a progressive unit. And I've picked school just to give a little bit of variety. I mean, one of my favorite units is actually Me in the World, because I like the intercultural element and the fact that we're looking at other French-speaking countries, not just France. But I thought that for today, I would show you the school unit because I wanted to show you some of the particular desk-based activities that we suggest. So everything happens within a week, within a unit, within a teaching type, and within a key stage.
Just keep an eye on the time.
Am I running late already?
Well, I'd say a little bit.
Okay, so I need to speed up. What's the time?
It's 9.
Okay, I'm going to be faster. So 6 lessons, 5 teaching lessons, 1 assessment lesson. So in lesson 1, they're learning 5 fruits and the determiner, and there's a focus on gender. Now you can see here, there's only 2 on the slide. We have a particular methodology of introducing vocabulary. All of our early learning language units are about memory skills. Yes, of course, remembering vocabulary and holding on to that vocabulary, but we also want it to be long-term. I don't want to return after a break and have to teach something again. We want this language to embed and that the children are able to recall it. So there is a particular way that we introduce vocabulary. When they start the lesson, it's only visual, and then we start to introduce the writing towards the end of the lesson. There are worksheets once they've done the interactive part of the lesson. Some of our schools only offer 30 minutes with the younger ones, which is fine for the interactive part on the interactive board, but there's lots of activities that you can do at the desk or for the children to take home should they wish. Lesson 2 introduces the next 5 fruits. If we can, we do differentiate by gender. It's not always possible, but where possible, we do. And we start to focus in lesson 3 on the gender. So I did say to you that when we develop our resources, we try and get the grammar in wherever we can in an appropriate form. So in this lesson, they're learning how to move the fruits from singular form to plural form, but there's a reason. Because if by the end of the unit, they want to say, I like apples, they're not going to say in French or Spanish or German, I like apple, I like apples. And we explain that to them, and everything is building, and the pupils will be completely on board with this, because in lesson 1, we do something called a learning intention sheet, where everything is spelled and organized, and the teacher would explain to the children what is happening over the course of the unit and what we want to be able to do by the end. So every unit, all of this is revisited. And in this unit, if we're going to be able to say that we like a particular fruit, we need to be able to say it in plural form. And there is lots of activities practicing this once it has been introduced to the children. Because one thing is teaching it, introducing it, explaining it. One thing is learning it, remembering it. And as you can see, by the time they get to lesson 4, it's the positive opinion. So building very slowly on those nouns, the articles, the determiners, gender. We now introduce the opinion. We've gone from singular to plural, what they like, and then they go to lesson 5, what they don't like. And they have a little role play by the end. And there are worksheets reinforcing what they've learned during the lesson in various skills. So you can see, was that fast enough?
Probably too fast.
Too fast now, you see?
Okay, you can slow down.
So you're doing fine. You're doing absolutely fine.
So tell me off afterwards and say you've gone, too so much, and then they don't understand. So in that unit, you can see that the way that it's all been organised is to break things down into small building blocks so that by the end of that unit, the children have something they can actually do. And what we want them to be able to do by the end of the fruit units is, of course, recall as many of those 10 fruits and the nouns and the articles as possible, but also be able to put it into something relevant. So to be able to say what fruit they like and what fruit they don't like, and the children manage.
And you'd have seen that across those slides that we showed you, just going through quite fast, that each of the skills was covered in that particular unit.
Yes.
So speaking, listening, reading, writing, grammar. And that's
absolutely
an early language unit.
And that's an early language. And the opinions, for example, would be revisited in many units. And each time the children encounter them, they are practicing them, they are embedding them, they are revisiting the opinions, but in a different context. So it's always very fun and engaging and relevant, but it's making sure that those core skills are embedded and that they have this bag of language that they can call on and learn that language is transferable. Because the one thing I didn't want to do is have everything that lived in boxes. And my experience in the past was that because these things are very fixed, pupils used to find it really hard to move things around. And by understanding what they're learning and really explaining how these words are put together, the children can then break things apart, put them together and make their own sentences. And that's what we want them to be. We want them to be really independent language learners.
I think you've got a couple of questions
Yeah,
there.
I was going to say, we've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. So the first one is there a focus on pronunciation and spelling rules in inverted commas through phonics? That's the first question. And the second question, what would the assessment lesson look like that you just mentioned?
If we've got an assessment.
I can show you what an assessment lesson, well, I can show you some screenshots of the assessment question sheet at the very end, Nicola. So if Francesca gives me a second.
I'll be really fast.
I will show it to you. But in terms of phonics and pronunciation, Alison, yes, a crucial part of language learning, something that has been emphasised probably more so in the new Ofsted framework that they're looking at. So we have specific phonics and pronunciation lessons developed for, we've got 4 lessons, Francesca. We built them into our unit planners. We encourage schools to teach 1 a year, and if they can. Obviously, if you're coming into languages or coming into Language Angels resources, your year 6 won't be able to get through all 4 phonics lessons if you teach 1 a year. So we'll encourage them to try and do all 4 lessons in the 1 year, so they get all of the basic phonic and pronunciation lessons taught to them, because those are the very basic principles of the language that they're going to be learning, in terms of what the language sounds like and how those sounds are put together to make words. And it is a fundamental part of the language learning process. So yes, we do.
And we have looked at the rules. I understand exactly what the question is. So we have focused on the rules and the exceptions, especially the French, and they do lots of activities. So the phonics lessons are a little bit longer because I wanted to have activities, again, showing the children what they can do with this new knowledge. And there is an unknown text in each lesson that builds, because ideally, if we're teaching 1 phonics lesson a year, as they move through the phonics program, by the time they get to that lesson 4, the text that they're presented with incorporates the previous sounds that they've learned. So by the time they get to that 4th lesson, now we have suggested they do 1 a year, but I mean, schools can do all 4, one after the lesson if they wish. But by the time they get to the last lesson, the key sounds are all in that unknown text. And basically, we're asking them to attempt to read the unknown text using their new knowledge on phonics. So lesson 1 introduces 4 or 5 sounds, lessons 2 introduces another 4 or 5 sounds, but repeats what they've learned in the first lesson. And it's, again, repeating, revising. So by the time they finish with the phonics program, they have, it's anything between 20 and 25 key sounds that they've been working on to listen to pronounce, to read from new words that they won't have met or encountered before, but encouraging them to apply that knowledge. And again, for the less confident teachers, we've obviously attached sounds to everything.
And relevant to today's session, actually, the 4 phonics lessons are progressive within themselves.
Yes, within themselves.
They progress because we start off with more basic sounds, and then we build on those in each subsequent lesson, so that the skills are developed and progressed over the course of.
And you've not said what the best thing is: the songs.
I've not seen it.
No, but we've had some songs commissioned for the phonics. So the sounds and the words that they are taught for the sound are then in a song, so that they are constantly hearing, repeating. I know that some of you, it's very difficult to sing at school, but they can do them at home. And then the unknown text brings everything together to see if all of that input is then in practice, if they can read unknown text. So it'll be interesting to see. Those were launched September, yes, during lockdown, over the summer. So it'll be interesting to see how schools find those, but we're very pleased with how they look, and feedback has been really good so far. No, we're not allowed to sing, I know, but we will be. But they're in the program, and the children can practice them at home. And it's got the sound written and the word it's attached to, and there is display material as well, if schools can have space to show that, so that it's constantly reinforced. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to constantly reinforce what they're learning in different forms and shapes and sizes, so that the children really are able to practice and remember, because we don't want to be just doing things just randomly. Everything should be for long-term retention and use.
Even though we're not allowed to sing at the moment, Rebecca, you're right. The songs still serve a purpose, because they're listening and hearing the sounds, and particularly with something like phonics. That's what we're trying to get them to get, both not just their mouth around, but also their ear around.
Yeah,
so
the listening is.
The songs still have a purpose.
So there's lots of listening exercises in the phonics lesson, where they have to pick the sound out from words, for example, and they might not see the word written, but they see the 4 or 5 sounds at the top of the page, and they have to decide which one of those sounds is in the word. And we start off with pair work, and then we ask them to share with the person sitting next to them, and they can decide if they think it's that sound or not. Now, I know that all of this has to be tweaked, because when they were written, we didn't think that, COVID was going to come and ruin everything, but there are things that you can apply and still use in those lessons. They can still be used. They just have to be tweaked a little bit. Right, so let's go to school. So obviously, school is towards the end of the language learning journey, and we have 10 school subjects. Now, whereas in early learning, we would divide the 10 nouns and introduce it, we introduce everything in lesson 1, because we are not just learning 10 nouns and articles for schools. So in lesson 1, they already have in one lesson, and we're expecting them to pick these words up much more quickly, because they've been used to the input of vocabulary. They understand the techniques and the skills involved. So they have the 10 nouns and articles in lesson 1. Lesson 2, as I said before, which is why I picked school, I wanted to show you how we reintegrate opinions, but now instead of 2, we have 4, for example, and there's going to be some more as we move through the unit. And they're saying what they like and they don't like in lesson 2. And again, we move it on a little bit further in their speaking task, where we're going to pretend to be Karim, and we're going to say what we like and we don't like, but we're also going to revise our name and our age. And you could also, for example, put in where country, brothers and sisters. I mean, there's lots of things that you can do with these activities, but the important thing is they get into the habit of repeating, recalling and using the vocabulary, but building on it. And they quite like it when they're provided with the details, because I've said that in my experience, often the children take longer to decide what they want to say than actually saying it. And that's not what we're asking them to do. We don't want them to they can make up characters and their details, but we want them to speak the language. So often at this point in the lesson, I would provide them with the details so we can just get to the task. And as they get more confident and they can move quicker, then of course they can talk about what they like and they don't like. But I would often provide them with all of the details first. Lesson 2 then introduces some adjectives and connectives. Now, some of you that are using our resources know that we offer this challenge section at the end of the lesson. So the lesson progresses, and then for those schools that maybe have an hour or are lucky enough to have more than one lesson a week, there are other things in the lesson that you can do to expand. Or it might be that you have some gifted and talented, or you have some extra time. And this would be the part of the lesson where you could really then explore and move on to being able to already in lesson 2 say a few phrases on what you like and you don't like at school. Lesson 3, yes, we introduce time. Time in Language Angels is divided into 2 halves. One is on the hour, and then in another unit we introduce quarter past, quarter to, and half past. The reason it's here is because we're encouraging the children to say what time they have particular lessons. Now again, they might not be able to tell you the truth because lessons don't happen on the hour, but it's a way of being able to use the language. And then there is an opportunity as an extra to have a look at an irregular verb. Now we haven't got time today, but one of the webinar programs that we're putting together is grammar. I know that some of you really want to know, what grammar do I introduce? When do I introduce it? Well, as an example, we would suggest having a look at a verb, an irregular verb in our school unit. This is the verb to go in French. Now, we will sit down and work out the program for after half term. But one of the ideas suggested is to explore grammar in the different teaching types and year groups and how to introduce grammar. So here you see a slide, and many of you are probably thinking, well, what does she mean? That's a slide. Are we going to teach them the verb to go? Well, not necessarily. We definitely want them to be able to say, I go, and understand that that's a conjugation. We're now into year 4 of language learning. If you've been following the program and you're in progressive, you've had at least 4 years, possibly 5, 6. And I would recommend starting to look at pronouns, for example, but obviously the scheme of work comes with lesson plans and teacher support notes, and it would explain what you would do with this lesson. That would be lesson 4. Lesson 5, we're bringing everything together, and we've got a form of a scaffold to start the children off, because it's a lot to ask them to remember everything. But obviously, as they start to practice and they start to remember, and they're writing an email and they're talking about things that they like at school and they don't like, and it's got adjectives and connectives, and we've had a look at a verb. So there's lots of freedom. So for the children that are very showing good skills in languages and they've really grasped all the concepts, they can start to write. And there would be some reading comprehensions, for example, on this, and listening. For those that are feeling less confident, we would provide the scaffold and we would give them the building blocks to still be able to put something together, but not necessarily from memory, but organising and making sure that the sentences make sense and they've been put in an organised fashion. So I've showed you what our teaching types look like, our early learning, our intermediate and progressive, how they show progression in terms of skills, and that we like to use all of the skills and grammar. I hope I've showed you what they look like. The question is now, what about if I wanted to measure it and I wanted to evidence it? So I think it's been clear so far what it looks like. How would I evidence it? And so I'm going to pass back to Paolo now. And for those of you that would want to measure it, for example, what could you do to measure it? So you can obviously see it. We can see what the children can do from the activities we've offered the children. We're going to be able to see it because they're going to be showing us. But what about if I haven't got a visitor in my class all the time, and externally someone's saying to me, well, prove it, show me, what is, how do you measure it? So I'm going to shift back out to the side. Give him plenty of space so he feels important.
Before we get into that that last part, before we get into that last part, I was going to say, Paolo, we've had some questions in the chat around
I like questions.
around the home delivery. How does it work exactly? Do the students have a login to access the resources, or is it just the teacher sends them the PowerPoint, or how does that actually work, the home delivery? Because obviously with the COVID safe classroom, this is absolutely essential.
So there are 2 different areas where pupils can access resources from home. There is teachers can set up logins for either the whole school, individual classes, or even individual pupils if they want. to give them access to our interactive games portal. And that will then enable you as the class teacher to select the games for the different units that the children can play from home. That's if you want to focus it purely on the interactive games aspect. If you're looking for a more rounded sort of holistic teaching experience that you can try and give to pupils to replicate at home, when COVID first happened, we decided to develop what we've called our homeschool site. And what that is it's a stripped back version of our teaching site. So Language Angels has been developed specifically for teachers to use in the classroom. COVID has resulted in a situation where some children can't come to the classroom. So what the homeschool site does is it provides them with PowerPoints, worksheets, interactive games, and karaoke songs, which they can do at home. There are a limited number of units currently on the homeschool site, but we've been asked to add more because we added a selection in to sort of best match our unit planners up until the summer. We're kind of hoping that we weren't going to be in the situation we look like we're going into now, where it's quite possible that children are going to be spending more time at home, whether that's nationally or in localized areas. So over the coming weeks, we're going to be adding and uploading more units to the homeschool site. So teachers can use that. So children can, if you like, autonomously follow the lessons from home whilst they're not able to come into school. So there are those two different platforms and areas, all included in the resources that teachers can use to give pupils access to.
Yeah, we had originally tried to limit what was on there for the simple reason we had a lot of parents contacting us at home, and they basically wanted to do it all with their children, which is great, but we didn't want the children then to go back into class and have half a class having done all the units in progressive, and then the other half still working on early learning and intermediate. So we tried to balance it, but we are in a position now where we're going to have to put more units on because
it's difficult, because we understand from a teacher's perspective you have to give the kids work to be able to do from home if they're not able to come into school for whatever reason. But it's trying to then balance that with looking a little bit further down the road when the children are all back in class, that we've got a situation where we haven't got then big disparities in not so much ability, but the amount of material that's already been covered. And that can make life more complicated for the class teacher, and if at all possible, we'd like to limit it. But the reality is children can't be at home doing nothing. So there will be more units added over the coming
weeks. The platform is ready, so we can put units up very quickly.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I'm sure the teachers and the parents really appreciate all the work you've done in relation to giving different options. In as you say, if children have to suddenly go home and what have you, I think it's absolutely brilliant. So that's fun. Yeah.
So, and again, that actually, sorry, just to go back to your original point, Joe, the homeschool site, we provide schools with a single login, which is specific for each individual school. They can give that to all of their pupils, then the pupils can just use the same login details to access.
And it's completely safe. That was the whole reason it was created. There's no data. There's nothing on there.
There's no communication between pupils and other pupils or pupils and anyone else. It's purely a platform where they can access materials.
Superb, thank you, excellent. So if we finish off with a tracking and progression tool, it's been amazing, as I knew it would be, but it's been amazing to hear it all again. And I'm just really impressed by the progression, which you've made really clear, that like the spine running through the whole of all the resources, it's just wonderful.
Yeah, and I think in the progression, I will go through the tracking tool very quickly. I'll put these question sheets up, going back to one of the earlier questions. Sorry, I think it was Nicola that asked the question. These are the question sheets, but progression is something we are very passionate about, because it is what language is, well, what any learning is about, really. And children respond so much more when they see that they're progressing themselves. You guys are teachers, you're in class, you see it. If a child doesn't feel they're progressing, they switch off.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone has to be aware.
Yeah, and that's difficult. So if we can build progression gradually, but also make it demonstrable for pupils themselves, then we're on to a winner. So the way we've built, Francesca's gone through in detail how we've built progression into the resources that we've developed. The tracking and progression tool is a bespoke tool that we've built to help evidence to pupils predominantly, but any other stakeholder that may ask the question, how are things going in our foreign language learning in our school? The tracking tool builds that in automatically, and it's based around the question sheets and answer sheets you can see on the screen. So what we've done is we've created sheets for every single unit where we ask 5 questions about speaking, 5 listening, 5 reading, 5 writing. Grammar is something we've not specifically asked questions on, but are intertwined into the questions that we do ask in the other skills. Each pupil fills in a question sheet. We've got the answer sheets. You can get the kids to mark it themselves. You can bring it in and mark it yourself. You give each skill a mark out of 5, and then you put that data into the tracking tool, and effectively that's your input done from the teaching side. What the tracking tool then does is takes the data you've put in and does 2 things. It's often whenever I show this screen, teachers start crying, they start throwing things, they try and punch me. It's always normal. I'm used to these things. What this is, not from Francesca, well, sometimes from Francesca. This is the learning and progression timeline. This is one of the things the tracking tool will develop. And what this does is it gives you a visual representation of that language learning journey we've been speaking about today. And it shows which units your pupils have completed over their time in your school. And importantly is this chart at the bottom of the screen, which shows which of the attainment targets they have met. And the coloured ticks demonstrate the number of the different levels of challenge at which they have met each attainment target. So we start off with a red tick, which is if they've met an attainment target at 1 level of challenge. The tick goes from red to orange if they've met that same attainment target at 2 levels of challenge, so early language and intermediate, for example. And eventually the tick will go to green when the same attainment target has been met at 3 levels of challenge, so early, intermediate, and progressive. The aim of the job is to get all of those ticks to be green by the end of their time in your school. As well as the learning and progression timeline, the tracking and progression tool will give you an in-depth history of each pupil's progression in the key skills we've spoken about: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And again, you'll get different reports and data which you can take out from the system. And all of this is developed and generated just by you inputting the scores from those end of assessment question sheets I showed you a couple of slides ago. I promised I was going to be quick. That's as much as I'm going to cover on it. The tracking and progression tool is something, if you're interested in more detail, contact us. We're happy to go into detail separately on that for you. Joe, we're going to hand it back to you. Our contact details I'll put on here, actually. That's probably easier. Thank you for letting us have this opportunity. Please feel free to visit the site. There is a free trial, completely cost-free, obligation-free. Francesca's email's there, my email's there, the phone number is there. Please, if you have any questions, suggestions, queries, just get in touch. Doesn't matter if you're a Language Angels user or not. We like to share and help and answer questions and get input from everybody. So please get in touch. We're always available. If the phone rings, it's just on the desk. We'll always answer it. Send an email. We try and answer it as quickly as possible, within 24 hours if possible. And when I started, I said we're growing the team. We're growing the team to give teachers more support. So new members have been brought on to specifically their job is to support teachers all the way through every single day. Right?
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
So
we want languages to be a success at primary, end of.
That's it.
That's it. We want everyone to love languages, and there's so many benefits to it. And it can be done really well. It can be. I think we've had bad press in the past, but there's a lot of really good work going on in schools, and we don't hear about it enough. Really good work. And it's not us, it's the teachers in schools.
No. Listen, I'll finish by saying that we have a motto here in Language Angels that all we do is provide resources. We always say to teachers, It's the magic you add in the classroom that makes all the difference. Without the magic you add, all we've got are resources. It's your magic that turns resources into great lessons. Never, ever forget that.
Wow, and that's an amazing message, I think, to finish with as well. We just got one more question, if it's okay, but thank you so much on behalf of everybody. Yeah, you'll see in the chat, there's lots of lovely comments thanking you for your time and sharing your resources. But we had another question around the homeschooling option. So Negin has said, if more units are added, will it be possible for us, the teachers, to be able to control what the children can access from home, which obviously relates to the issue that you brought up?
It is something we can do. It's something that we've been thinking about for a while. So Negin, yes, my developers, they try to punch me a lot as well, as I'm sure you can imagine. But yes,
we didn't imagine the parents getting in touch. That was what surprised us actually during lockdown. We had all the contact with the staff, which was brilliant, and they didn't not want to teach languages. And we found that so amazing that we tried to get the site up, and we did quickly. But then we had the parents contacting us, and it's just trying to find that balance, really.
Yeah, I think the aim is to make it a sort of a situation where teachers can, much like the interactive games, they can pick the units that children will see when they access the homeschool site. I'm currently in discussions with my developers about that. And again, I'll keep you updated as and when those conversations go forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I think we'll stop there if that's okay. But I just think, thank you so much for repeating. And it wasn't. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's my pleasure. It's just I think that the last message that you said about it's all about the teachers and the amazing things they do. And I think that's very much where I'm coming from as well. And I think that the comments that you'll see in the chat, the comments are really lovely, and people are very appreciative of what you've been doing. Gemma, for example, has said that she's just become a new subscriber in September, and tonight's session has helped me so much. It's just great. It's really great. So thank you so much.
Support the schools. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to support them and make languages a success. So I don't want the resources just to sit on the site. We want them to be used and for the children to enjoy them with the staff.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, well, I'll stop the recording now, and there we are.